Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, you may press star 1 on your phone to ask a question. I would also like to remind all parties that today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Deborah Rivera. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. As Marcus stated, my name is Deborah Rivera, and I am a training specialist for the Census Bureau. First of all, I'd like to give everyone a warm welcome for joining us today for the continuation of our SIPP webinar series. Today is webinar number 3 in the series, where our speaker will be discussing the jobs content in waves 1 and 2 of the 2014 SIPP panel. And if you missed the first 2 webinars where we covered an overview of the SIPP and demographics and residences, those are available right now on the Census Academy site. So if you'd like to take a look at those, we'll be sharing a link on the screen in a few minutes. The SIPP webinar series will continue throughout the month of June, and the next webinar will be taking place tomorrow, Tuesday, June 18th at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, and that will be a webinar on assets, income, and poverty. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this webinar, and along with the training materials associated with it, those will be posted on the Census Academy site as a free learning resource. Should take about maybe 2-3 days to get that up there, but do keep checking back. We will have a live question and answer session that will be taking place at the end of the presentation, but keep in mind that we also have a chat feature available if you want to submit a written question instead. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Shelley Irving. Shelley Irving is a survey statistician in the SIPP coordination and outreach staff. She has been at the Census Bureau since 2009 and has worked on the SIPP the entire time, working on a variety of capacities. Prior to joining the Census Bureau, Shelley received a PhD in sociology and demography from Penn State. Thank you so much, Shelley. Take it away.
Thank you, Deb. All right. As Deb said, I will be discussing the jobs data in the 2014 Survey of Income and Program Participation. So my name is Shelley Irving, and I am your presenter today. I am part of the SIPP coordination and outreach staff here at the Census Bureau. Also on the line with me are Matthew Marley and Holly Fee, who are also on the SIPP coordination and outreach staff. In addition, we have our subject matter expert, Mark Clee, from our labor force statistics branch. As Deb also mentioned, we are doing a series of SIPP webinars that will take place throughout this month. We are covering waves 1 and 2 of the 2014 public use SIPP data. We do have supplemental materials, including exercises and handouts for most of the topics. All of the webinars will be recorded and posted for later reference, and here's a website you can go to learn more about this webinar series and all webinars offered by the Census Bureau. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the 7 different webinar topics as well as their session dates. Today, we are going to be discussing the jobs data in SIPP as well as our no jobs, industry, occupation, and class of worker, and work schedule and commuting data. And then I will follow that up by offering some resources for data users. So let's begin with a discussion of our jobs data. SIPP data provide information on up to 7 discrete jobs or businesses that were held during the reference year for each adult respondent. Keep in mind that adult respondents are the respondents age 15 or older at the time of interview, and respondents can have up to 2 spells of employment per job or business. Additionally, there is a summary level timeline for additional work beyond the first 7 jobs for any respondent who reported more than 7 discrete jobs or businesses. For each of those jobs or businesses, we have the dates of employment, the reason why a job ended, the types of pay and pay rate, business profits, the number of hours usually worked per week, including the reason a respondent worked part-time, and changes in earnings and/or hours worked with up to 2 changes per job spell. We also have the business and employer size and type, union membership, incorporation status, presence of business partners, and time away without pay, including reasons for time away without pay. There are some things you should probably know when you go to use the jobs data. I'll discuss some of them here. So jobs are weekly, but our job spells are monthly. That means if you are working with this data, you will need to know how weeks fit into months. We do follow the same convention that we used in the 2008 SIPP panel. Weeks are defined as Sunday through Saturday, and if a week crosses into 2 months, it is assigned to the month with 4 or more days. There is a variable on the file, RWKSPERM, that indicates the number of weeks in a particular month. It takes on a value of 4 or 5. So to demonstrate this concept, we have 3 calendar months presented on the screen: April, May, and June. Looking first at April, we see that the first week in April contains 5 days, so it is assigned to the month of April. The last week in April contains 4 days, so it is also considered a week. In this case, April contains 5 weeks. Turning our attention to May, we see that the first week in May only has 3 days in May, so as we already saw, that week was attributed to April. So May only has 4 weeks. Looking at June, the first week in the month only has 2 days, and so the last week in the month of June only has 2 days, so this week would be attributed to July. So in this case, June only has 4 weeks, and I will discuss a little bit more about this in a minute. One job line should represent work for one employer in most cases, and I will show you an example of this in a second. The variable EJBN_JOBID is a longitudinally consistent employer or business identifier, where the N there refers to the job lines 1 through 7. In short, job ID does for jobs the same thing that SSUID does for households and PNUM does for people. It is a linking variable that enables you to follow a job across waves. The job lines that we use to refer to employers when we talk about a single wave are allowed to change across waves. So for example, suppose that in wave 1, we have a job on job line 1 that ends in the middle of a reference year, and a job on job line 2 that was ongoing as of the end of the reference year. In wave 2, the job that was on job line 1 in wave 1 disappears, and the job that was on job line 2 in wave 1 moves up to line 1. With all of this movement, the only way to follow a job across waves is to link it using job ID. I will demonstrate this point later in the presentations. Data users would be interested in linking jobs across waves if you wanted to do something such as calculate time spent working on a particular job. And then we also have other jobs data. So this data was suppressed on the public use file for disclosure reasons. However, I do want to mention that information on other jobs is included in our recode variables. So this is a screenshot of the event history calendar, or the EHC, as it is seen in the SIPP instrument. In this case, the respondent has 2 reported jobs. Job line 1 is at an animal shelter, and job line 2 is babysitting. There were no jobs reported on job lines 3 through 7. And then below job line 7, you see the other jobs category, which would be used if a respondent had reported 7 jobs and then had additional jobs that needed to be reported. All of those would get grouped into more jobs, if any. Self-employed individuals may have negative monthly earnings if their businesses run at a loss that exceeds any salary drawn from the businesses. Comparing to ACS and CPS, or put differently, ACS and CPS bottom code self-employed earnings at levels closer to 0. Some variables can change within a job spell, most do not. Extra earnings indicators, extra earning amount, and select recodes do change within a spell. I will mention that extra earnings includes bonuses, commission, tips, and overtime pay. The recode status flags for our employment and earnings data are all set to 9, which corresponds to can be determined from the allocation flags for the components of this recode. So as you might guess, you can use the component variables to create your own status flags. If you are interested, our Labor Force Statistics branch has some code available to do this. The code either is or will be available on their website, and we will make sure that the SIPP website links to that code as well. So now I'd like to talk about some of the key jobs variables. There are a lot of jobs variables, so I will just discuss some of them that are probably the most pertinent to data users. If you are interested in the full range of variables that are available, check out our metadata, our data dictionary, and I'll show you ways to access that at the end of the presentation. So to begin, we have our employment screener, EJBN_SCRNR. This is a flag indicating the presence of job N during the reference year. There are 2 key employment status recodes. These are considered recodes because they are variables that are not directly asked of respondents, but are instead created from other variables. The first is RMESR, the monthly employment status recode. The second is RWKESRI, which is the employment status recode for week I. Next, there are 3 key earnings recodes variable. These recodes have the T prefix instead of the R because they are recodes that have been tab coded. First, we have TP earn, which is the total monthly earnings across jobs. This does include profits from all jobs, even though these are not included in TJBN_MSUM, which is the same as it was in 2008 SIPP. TJBN_MSUM is the portion of total monthly earnings attributed to job N. This includes extra earnings on job N, even though these are not included in TJBN_WKSUMI. TJBN_WKSUMI is the portion of total monthly earnings on job N attributed to week I. This includes only wage and salary pay in week I. We have several variables associated with the start and end date of a job. EJBN_B month. This is the begin month of a job spell with employer N in the reference year. So a value of 1 would mean that the job started in January to February and so on. EJBN_StartWK is the begin week of a job spell with employer N in the reference year. So a value of 1 indicates the first week of the year. A value of 12 would indicate the 12th week of the year, and so on. B month and start week will equal 1 for any job that began in or prior to January of 2013 in a Wave 1 interview. Accordingly, you will need to use these next 3 variables to tell if the job spell began in January or sometime prior to January of the reference year. EJBN_STRTJAN is a yes-no indicator of whether job N began in January of the reference year. If it did not start in January of the reference year, we ask the month and the year the job started. Those variables are EJBN_STRTMON and TJBN_STRTYR. These variables are analogous to TSJ date 1 and 2 and TSB date 1 and 2 in the 2008 and prior SIPP panels. One important difference is that because we could refer to prior waves when editing in the 2008 panel, we carried these variables across waves to ensure consistency. Since we can no longer refer to prior waves when editing in the 2014 panel, start year and start month are only in universe for new sample entrants. So if you want to derive the analogs of TSJ date 1 and 2 and TSB date 1 and 2 in the 2014 panel, the only way to do this is to link across waves using SSUID, PNUM, and job ID to keep track of when the job begins. The SIPP data file also provides the end month and end week of job spells, which are EJBN_E month and EJBN_ENDWK. Additionally, the variable RJBN_CONTFLG indicates whether the job spell with employer N continued past December of the reference year. I do want to mention that data users can calculate tenure by weeks for jobs that started in the reference year, but only by month for jobs that began prior. There are 4 key hours worked recodes. TMWKHRS is the average hours worked per week at all jobs. TJBN_MWKHRS is the average hours worked per week at job N. TWKHRSI is the number of hours worked at all jobs in week I, and TJBN_WKHRSI is the hours worked at job N in week I. And then we have our type of work arrangement variable. This is EJBN_JBORSE. So this indicates whether a respondent worked for an employer, was self-employed, or had some other type of work arrangement. And SIPP is the only survey that I'm aware of that has this third category of other work arrangements. Finally, we have our key reasons variables. EJBN_RSN is the main reason a respondent stopped working for employer N. EJBN_RENDB is the main reason a respondent gave up or ended business N. EJBN_AWOPREX is the reason for time without pay for employer N for spell X, and EJBN_PTRESNX is the main reason the respondent worked less than 35 hours at employer N for spell X. Now that we've talked about some of the key labor force variables, let's go ahead and look at some example jobs data. So what you're seeing here is some data from it's example data from a single wave of SIPP data. So we have 12 monthly records associated with month codes 1 through 12 for a single respondent. If you look at EJB1_SCRNR, you see that this is equal to 1, indicating the presence of job 1 during the reference year. This variable is not time varying. It will equal 1 for all months of the year if a job is reported in job line 1 at any time during the reference year. For this job, there were 2 job spells reported at the same employer. The first spell had a B month of 1 and an E month of 4, telling us that the job spell started in January and ended in April. The second spell had a B month of 8 and an E month of 12, meaning it went from August through December. And keep in mind that we're only looking at the 12 months of the reference year. For job 1 EJB1 underscore JBORSE is equal to 1, which tells us that the respondent worked for an employer, and TJB1 underscore MSUM is the portion of total monthly earnings attributed to job N. As a side note, earnings can be reported by respondents weekly, monthly, biweekly, however they get paid. However, all of that data is edited to be a monthly amount. So even if they get paid weekly, what you see in MSUM is their monthly earnings. And you will note that the monthly earnings may vary month to month. Looking at our screener for job line 2, EJB2 underscore SCRNR, this is equal to 2, meaning that this respondent did not work at any additional job or business during the reference year. Though it's not presented, if we were to look at the screeners for job lines 3 through 7, you would see the same thing. Accordingly, all of the job 2 variables are not in universe and set to missing. So let's look at some more detailed information about job 1 for the same respondent. In particular, I want to know if this first job spell started in January or prior to January of the reference year. As a reminder, the information related to the start date of a job spell is limited to a Wave 1 interview or for new sample members in subsequent waves. In looking at EJB1 underscore B month, we see that this job is reported to have started in January of the reference year. EJB1 underscore start WK tells us that it started in the first week of the year. This information doesn't tell us whether this job started in the first week of January or sometime prior to the first week in January. Looking at EJB1 underscore STRTJAN, we see a value of 2 telling us that this job did not start in January of the reference year. EJB1 underscore STRTYR is equal to 2010, and EJB1 underscore STRTMON is equal to 10, telling us that this job spell actually started in October of 2010. Moving on to the second job spell. Because this spell did not start until August or week 33 of the year, there is no need to ask when this spell started. It started in the 33rd week of the year, which fell in the month of August. Accordingly, all of the left sensor variables are not in universe and set to missing. But in a similar way, we know that most spells don't actually end in December of the reference year. So we have the continuation flag, in this case RJB1 underscore CONTFLG, which is equal to 1 and tells us that this spell continued into the interview year as opposed to actually ending in December of the reference year. Now let's move on to another example to highlight the weekly and monthly earnings data. Again, we are looking at 12 months of data for a single respondent. We see B month equal to 1 and E month equal to 12, indicating that a job lasted January through December of the reference year. TJB1 underscore MSUM is the portion of total monthly earnings attributed to job 1. TJB1 underscore WK SUM 1 through 5 are the portion of total monthly earnings on job 1 attributed to weeks 1 through 5. You'll notice that some of the months have values on week sum 5 while others do not. Notice that where RWKSPERM is equal to 5, TJB1 underscore WK SUM goes through 5. In those months, there are 5 weeks attributed to that month. Okay. I lost my spot there for a second. All right. And then where WKS PERM is equal to 4, the fifth week sum variable is missing. Next, let's see how TJB1 underscore WK SUM 1 through 5 variables are related to TJB1 underscore MSUM. The first thing you'll probably notice is that 800 times 5 does not equal 3,543. So how did we come up with this number for MSUM? What we did is we multiplied 800 by the total number of weeks in the month. So 31 divided by 7 was then multiplied by 800 to come up with 800 times the 4.4286 weeks that were in the month of January to get a value of 3,543. February with 4 weeks is a little easier to understand. It's just 800 times 4, you get 3,200. Those of you with an eye for detail will wonder what is going on in October of this year. So 800 times the 31 divided by 7 equals 3,543. It does not equal the reported 3,763. Remember that the MSUM includes extra earnings on job N, even though these are not included in the week sum variables. Now, let's see how the MSUM variables fit into TP-EARN. Here is a different example with 12 monthly records again for a single respondent. This respondent has a job line 1 that the job is reported to go January through December of the reference year. And accordingly, we have the total monthly earnings attributed to job 1 for all of those months. This respondent also had a job reported on job line 2 for May through June and again from October through December. There is earnings data for this job in the appropriate months. If you add the earnings from job 1 in yellow and the job 2 in blue, you will get the total monthly earnings across all jobs in green. Now let's move to an example where we combine waves 1 and 2 to see how the job ID variable works. So what I have here is a long file. So month codes 1 through 12 refer to wave 1. Month code 12 to 14 refers to wave 2. Remember that I added 12 to the wave 2 month code values to get values of 12 through 24. On the data file, they have values of 1 through 12, so I added 12 to get the values of, 13 through 24. And I'm not showing all of the months here because there is simply not enough room on this slide. In wave 1, the respondent had a job in job line 1 for January through March of 2013. This job was assigned job ID 102. There is no continuation flag for this spell because it does not have an end month of 12. This respondent had a second job in job line 2 that spanned April through December of 2013. This job was assigned job ID 101. The job 2 continuation flag tells us that the job on job line 2 continued into the interview year, which then becomes the reference year for wave 2. In wave 2, the respondent had a job reported on job line 1 in January through October. This job was assigned job ID 101. So job 2 in wave 1 has a job ID of 101, and job 1 in wave 2 has a job ID of 101, meaning that this is the same job, even though they are on different job lines. We would expect the spell to continue into wave 2 as the continuation flag in the wave 1 data told us that the spell continued into the interview year. So we know that the respondent worked at the same job from April of 2013 to October of 2014. And then this respondent had an additional Wave 2 spell that was recorded in job line 2 from September through December of 2014. And since this was a new job that was reported in Wave 2, it was given the job ID of 201. Just a couple of notes about the jobs data. All self-employed individuals are asked about their profits, even though in the 2008 SIPP panel, only unincorporated business owners were asked. We do notice left heaping of new jobs, that is, a disproportionate fraction of new jobs were reported to have begun in week 1 of 2013. In our SIPP instrument, we did implement range follow-ups for the wage and salary earnings data. So this means, for example, if a respondent reported getting paid weekly but didn't know the amount, we then asked, well, was it less than $400 a week? Was it between $400 and $599 a week, between $600 and $999, or $1,000 or more? So that when we went to impute the data, we would just impute within that range if they provided a range, rather than imputing from the whole spectrum of income data. Separate questions about the receipt and amounts of bonuses, commission, tips, and overtime payments were used in the 2014 SIPP. And we used less feedback data compared with the 2008 SIPP panel on our earnings data because we wanted to get more current reports of earnings when we went back into the field to interview people in Waves 2+. That was a quick overview of our jobs data. Now we will discuss our no jobs data. So this includes spells of non-employment, time spent searching for work, time spent on layoff from a job or business, reason for not working, and unpaid family work. I do want to mention that our no jobs and employment data don't have explicitly defined start and stop weeks. You will need to identify the weeks in the month when no job was worked using the start week, end week, and employment status recode variables, which are listed on your screen. And I will show you an example of this momentarily. Here's a listing of some of our key no jobs variables. So we have ENJ flag, which is a flag indicating the presence of a no job spell during the month. We have ENJ_B month, which is the begin month of a no job spell in the reference year. ENJ_E month, the end month of a no job spell in the reference year. ENJ_NOWRKJ, which is the reason for not working for pay in this non-employment spell, where J is equal to the specific reasons. So for example, 1 equals injury, 2 equals illness, and so on. There are 12 reasons in total. ENJ_LKWRK is an indicator that the respondent actively looked for work in 1 or more weeks during the no job spell. ENJ_layoff tells us whether the respondent spent time on layoff for a no job spell this month. And ENJ_UPDWKYN telling us whether the respondent worked without pay in a related household member's family business or farm. Now let's move into an example to demonstrate how the no jobs data don't have explicitly defined start and stop weeks, even though the jobs data do. If you know the weeks in which a job started and stopped, you can identify weeks when the respondent was not working. So here we are looking at some example data. We have 12 monthly records for one respondent. And as a side note, this example sort of will apply to the calendar year 2013. Due to changes in the way weeks fall into months from year to year, you will see some fluctuations across waves. So this respondent was employed by the same employer January through June and again August through December of the reference year. Which weeks of the year was this respondent working? So we see that he worked in weeks 5 through 24 and again in weeks 34 through 52, or the end of the reference period. Based on that information, we know that he was not working in weeks 1 through 4 and again weeks 25 through 33. Yet, without the jobs data, all we would know is that there was a spell of non-employment in January and again from June through August, which in some ways appears to overlap with job 1. In January, June, and August, the respondent has both a job spell and a no job spell. Looking at the weekly employment status recodes, RWKESR, and 1 through 5 gives us the weekly information that we need. Looking here in weeks 1 through 4 of the reference year, RWKESR is equal to 4. The respondent had no job or business and was looking for work or on layoff. In weeks 5 through 24, the weekly employment status recode is equal to 1. He was working at a job or business. In weeks 25 through 30, RWKESR equals 5, telling us that he was without a job or business and not looking for work or on layoff. Then in weeks 31 through 33, the value changes to 4, telling us that he was without a job or business and looking for work or on layoff. Finally, in weeks 34 through 52, the weekly employment status recode is equal to 1, so he was again working in those weeks. Now moving on to our industry, occupation, and class of worker data. I think that it's helpful to start with some definitions. So industry is the kind of business conducted by a person's employing organization. Occupation is the kind of work the person does on the job. And class of worker is the type of ownership of the employing organization. A couple of things to know about these data. The 2014 SIPP panel was coded with the 2010 Census Occupation Code List and the 2012 Census Industry Code List. The 2004 and 2008 SIPP panels were coded with the 2002 Census Occupation Code List and the 2002 Census Industry Code List. The use of different code lists mean that the industry and occupation data are not directly comparable between SIPP panels. To make them comparable, feel free to contact our industry and occupation branch for instructions and documentation, and check out the website that is listed on your screen. Industry and occupation data on unpaid family workers is found in the No Job section of the survey, unlike in previous panels where unpaid family work was a category under the class of worker variable. And as I will show you, industry, occupation, and class of workers variables don't change within a job spell. Our key industry and occupation variables, we have TJBN_ING, which is the industry code for job N, TJBN_ICC, which is the occupation code for job N, EJBN_CLWRK is the class of worker for job N, TNJ_IND is the industry code for unpaid family work, and TNJ_OCC is the occupation code for unpaid family work. So let's look at some example data to see how these variables play out. We have 12 monthly records for one respondent. And what we're looking at here is I want to show an example of someone who reports 2 job spells for a single employer. Do note, however, that most people only report 1 spell. We see that this respondent had a job spell that lasted January through July of the reference year, and a second job spell in that same job line that spanned August through December of the reference year. First, I want to point out that the industry and class of worker variables don't change within a job line, which refers to a single employer. Also want to note that the full list for industry and occupation codes is available online in our data dictionary or metadata, which are the same thing. It is several pages long, which is why I don't include it here. I will just tell you what these numbers refer to, but feel free to go online and look at this documentation if you are interested. So in this respondent's case, TJB1_IND, which is the industry code, is a value of 5170, telling us that this respondent worked in a clothing store. TJB_CLWRK is the class of worker. A value of 5 tells us that he was an employee of a private for-profit company. While the occupation doesn't change within a reported job spell, it can change across spells. So here, take TJB1_OCC for the first spell is equal to 4760, telling us that the respondent was a retail salesperson during this first spell. In the second spell, TJB1_OCC changes to 4700, indicating that he became a first-line supervisor of retail sales workers. Of course, this detailed level of information, such as a change in occupation within an employer, depends on how well respondents report this information. Now, let's turn our attention to an example of the no jobs, industry, and occupation data that combines waves 1 and 2. This is a wide data file, so on the left-hand side of the screen with the suffix _W1, we have our wave 1 variables. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have our wave 2 variables with the suffix _W2. And again, the industry and occupation listings for the no jobs data is also available in our data dictionaries. In wave 1, this respondent had 3 no job spells, one in March, another April through August, and a third one in September. In wave 2, this respondent had 2 no job spells. The first lasted May through August, and the second was just in September. Looking at the first and third no job spells in wave 1 and the second no job spell in wave 2, we see that ENJ_UPDWKYN is equal to 2, telling us the respondent was not working 15 or more hours per week without pay in a related household member's family business or firm. In the second no job spell in wave 1 and the first no job spell in wave 2, ENJ_UPDWKYN is equal to 1, telling us the respondent was working 15 or more hours per week without pay in a related household member's family business or farm. In both waves 1 and 2, this unpaid work is classified under industry code 0170, which is crop production, and the unpaid work is classified under occupation code 6050, which is miscellaneous agricultural worker. Now let's take a look at our commuting and work schedule data. So for commuting, we have information on the means of transportation to work, the distance to work, the minutes to work, parking and toll expenses, additional commuting expenses, and other job-related expenses. Under work schedule, we collect information about the days of the week worked, the days of the week worked entirely at home, start and end times of work, type of schedule worked, and reason for working a specific schedule. The commuting and work schedule data are collected at the spell level for each reported job, and they are copied to the monthly record for a specific job spell. Here is a listing of some of our key commuting and work schedule variables. EJBN underscore PVWKTR 1 through 9 and PVWKTRA, which refers to 10, is all of the means of transportation used for job N. I will show an example of this in a minute. And then we have EJBN underscore PVTRPRM, which is the primary means of transportation for job N. TJBN underscore PV mile is the miles to work one way for job N. TJBN underscore PV time is the minutes to work one way for job N. Minutes and miles to work are unique to the SIPP data. We also have RJBN underscore COMMTYP. This is a recode indicating the commute distance for each job that is available starting in Wave 2 of the 2014 SIPP. This gives you information such as the respondent did not work, the respondent worked from home, the respondent lived and worked in the same state, city, or town, the respondent worked in the same state but in a different town, and so on. And there are 9 total categories there. Again, you can look at our data dictionary if you're interested in this variable. We also have EJBN underscore DYS WKD, which is the number of days worked per week at job N, and EJBN underscore DYS WKDH, which is the number of days worked only at home per week for job N. I do want to note that the N here refers to job lines 1 through 7, so this information is similar, it was reported the same way that the jobs data were, so respondents can have up to 7 reported jobs. And we have this information available separately for each job reported. Let's go ahead and look at some example data. Here we have 12 monthly records for one respondent. There are 10 potential means of transportation to work. I'm only showing 3 of them here. So where PVWKTR1 is associated with driving your own vehicle to work. PVWKTR2 is associated with being a rider in someone else's vehicle or van pool. And PVWKTR3 is associated with riding the bus, and there are 7 more if you're interested in this data. EJB1 underscore PVWKTR1 is equal to 1, or yes, so we know that this respondent drove his or her own vehicle to work. PVWKTR3 is also equal to 1, so we know that this respondent also rode the bus to work. We don't know, however, if he drove to the bus stop or if he drove some days and took the bus on other days. PVWKTR2 is equal to 2 or no, so we know the respondent was not a rider in someone else's vehicle or van pool. In the second job spell for job line 1, EJB1 underscore PVWKTR1 is equal to 1, so we know that he drove to work. PVWKTR2 and PVWKTR3 are equal to 2, indicating that the respondent was not a rider in someone else's vehicle or van pool and did not ride the bus to work. For both job spells, the primary means of transportation to work was driving, as told to us by the variable EJB1 underscore PVTRPRM. And the average one-way commute time was 20 minutes for this first job spell. but it increased to 35 minutes in the second job spell. We would have to look at additional information that is available on the data file to indicate the reason for this change. The respondent may have moved further away from work, or he may have switched job locations, so he may have transferred to a different location for the same firm. And this information is available elsewhere in the data file, but not in the variables that I chose to present here. Let's look at a separate example looking at the long data file. We're combining waves 1 and 2. So I'm just showing months 12 and 24, so December of waves 1 and wave 2. And I have 4 respondents from 3 different households. So the wave 1 data is on top, the wave 2 data is at the bottom. Looking at the variable JBORSE, this describes the type of work arrangement. So this is a nice variable to use because if it has a value of 1 through 3 versus a missing value for a specific job line, it indicates the presence of a job spell for that month. So looking at December of 2013 and December of 2014, we see who reported working in those months. In wave 1, respondents 1, 2, and 4 had jobs. And again, I know this because of the values of 1 through 3 in EJB1_JBORSE in this month. In wave 2, at the bottom of your screen, all 4 of the respondents had a job in December of their reference year. For respondents holding a job during the month, there is information about the total number of days per week the respondent worked at this job. In this example, it ranges from 2 days a week to 6 days a week. There is also data on the usual number of days per week the respondent worked from home. Similarly, we see that only the first respondent in our example data held a second job in December of waves 1 and wave 2. If the respondent has a job reported in job line 2, we see the usual number of days per week worked at the second job and the number of days per week the respondent worked from home. That wraps up our jobs content. I will just speak briefly about some of the resources that are available to data users now. Currently available on the webinar website, we have exercises. So we have several for our jobs content, 1 exercise for no jobs, 1 for industry and occupation, and 1 for work and commuting schedule. There is a handout for the exercise as well as SAS and STATA solution code. You can access those materials through this website provided. And for just general data resources on SIPP, the SIPP website is great. We also have the Census FTP site where you can access the data dictionary, weights, and then we highly recommend the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Resources SIPP page. They have a fantastic SIPP page if you're interested in that. Generally, we will point people to our SIPP website for anything related to SIPP. There you can find users guides, metadata, release notes, users notes, codebook, and crosswalks. So we crosswalk 2008 to 2014 and 2014 to 2008. I do want to mention a couple of publications that we have using the 2014 SIPP on the SIPP website. Here are 2 that use the data that we talked about in today's webinar. We have multiple job holders in the United States and common pay patterns and extra earnings, as well as a whole host of other publications that were used using SIPP data. Our next SIPP webinar is scheduled for tomorrow. We will cover assets, income, and poverty in the 2014 SIPP. Here's a website again. You can learn more about this and other census webinars, as well as our schedule and the session dates for the SIPP webinars. and these are all scheduled at 2 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us for our jobs webinar. You can feel free to contact us anytime at this website, or excuse me, at the email address or the phone number provided. And our website is a great source of information as well. And I think at this point, we will work with the operator to open up the line for Q&A.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please press star followed by 1 on your phone and clearly record your name. One moment, please, while we wait for the first question.
Marcus, this is Deb. I'm wondering, do we have any questions on queue?
We have no questions on queue.
Okay, great. So we will give it a few more minutes before we conclude today's session, in case anybody does have questions. But in the meantime, I just wanted to thank Shelley Irving, Matthew Marley, Holly Fee, who have been, putting these presentations together. It's very much appreciated. And I want to let everybody know that once you close out of your WebEx screen, you will see an evaluation report link that's going to pop up. So we really appreciate if you just take 2-3 minutes of your time to fill it out. Not very many questions, but we do appreciate all of the feedback that you can provide, including what other types of webinars you'd like to see us present on, and also how we can improve our webinar sessions. And I will also show you very briefly here where you are able to find additional information for the SIPP webinars, including all of the handouts that Shelley was just talking about. So we have the Census Academy landing site, and if you click on webinars and then recorded webinars, here we have the overview session, which includes the previously recorded webinar that Matthew Marley presented on with the course materials. And in addition to that, we have the second webinar for the SIPP webinar series on demographics and residences that was presented by Holly Fee, once again with all of the course materials, exercises, and handouts available. So with that, once again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll do one last call to see if we have any questions, but otherwise that will conclude today's session. Marcus, do we have any questions?
No questions at this time.
Okay, great. So thank you everybody for joining us once again. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.
Somebody on chat just raised his hand. Can we take that question? I'm not sure.
If they would prefer to ask through the phone line, they have to press *1 and record their name. Marcus will let them through. But if they would prefer to submit the question via the chat, they can do that as well, and then Matthew, you can read it out loud for us. Marcus, is anybody queued up to ask? Or Matthew, are they submitting the question through the chat?
I have no questions in queue.
I sent Arthur a chat. I will wait around and just in case he sends it. Otherwise, we can follow up with him offline.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, great. So, all right, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thank you again, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you for participating in today's conference. Please disconnect at this time.